Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so that you do not miss any video lesson from Rao's IAS.
Hello and welcome to Daily Prelims Practice, where we take up the questions from the Hindu and the Indian Express and curate the question as per the demands of civil services prelims. The topics for the discussion have been listed on your screen. Moving on to the first question of the day, the article has featured in the Hindu and basically talks about Prevention of Money Laundering Act. Now UPSC previously has also asked questions related to various acts, their recent amendments, and such a question was seen in the year 2019 where UPSC asked about Indian Forest Act. So this area and the pieces of legislation becomes important for us. The practice question says, consider the following statement regarding Prevention of Money Laundering Act. The first statement here is, the PMLA was enacted in response to India's commitment under Vienna Convention. Now this statement is correct, as the PMLA was enacted in response to India's global commitment under Vienna Convention to combat the menace of money laundering. These further included conventions like United Nations Convention against illicit traffic in narcotic drugs, Basis Statement of Principles, recommendations of Financial Action Task Force, and Political Declaration and Global Program of Action adopted by United Nations General Assembly. Moving on to the second statement, it says money laundering is treated as predicate offense that is not a standalone crime. Now this statement is incorrect, as the recent amendment that is brought in the Act has redefined money laundering. Money laundering was not an independent crime, rather was dependent on another crime, and thus it was known as predicate offense. But the recent amendment that the Government of India has brought in, the amendment seeks to treat money laundering as a standalone crime. Moving on to the third statement, it says PMLA is applicable to individual, companies, partnership, or the branches controlled by them. Now this statement is again correct. The PMLA is applicable to all persons, which may include individual, companies, firms, partnership firms, association of persons, and incorporation. Further giving a boost to the Act, the agency or the branches that are owned and controlled by the above mentioned persons are also included under definition of PMLA. The question further says choose the correct code, and the correct code for the given question will be option B, as only statement 1 and 3 are correct. Moving on to the next question that has featured in the Hindu, it basically talks about the issue of reservation, as it has been in the news due to the question over constitutionality of 103rd Constitutional Amendment Act. Now UPSC under the Polity section has a favorite section related to fundamental rights, and every year we see a question related to fundamental rights. Such a question was also seen in the year 2020. So this region becomes important from the perspective of prelims. The practice question in this regard says, consider the following statement with respect to reservation in India. The first statement here is, Article 16 provides for reservation of appointments or posts in favor of any backward class of citizens which in the opinion of state is not adequately represented in the services under the state. Now this statement is correct, as under Article 16(4), the state can provide reservation in public employment to the backward class of citizens which are not adequately represented in the services under the state. Moving on to the second statement, it says 103rd Constitutional Amendment Act 2019 provided up to 10% reservation to economically weaker section or the EWS. Now this statement is again correct, as 103rd Constitutional Amendment Act introduced reservation for EWS for admission to central government run education institutions and private education institutions, except for those of minority education institution, and at the same time it also provided for employment in government jobs. Moving on to the third statement, it says 102nd Constitutional Amendment Act 2019 extends the deadline for secession for the reservation of seats for members from SC/ST in Lok Sabha and State Legislative Assembly by a period of 10 years. Now this statement is incorrect, as the reservation of seats for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes was set to expire on 26 January 2020, and it was mandated earlier by the 95th Constitutional Amendment Act. But this has now been extended for another 10 years with the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act and not 102nd Constitutional Amendment Act. The question further says which of the following statements given above are correct, and as only statement 1 and 2 are correct, the correct code for the given question will be option A. Moving on to the next article that has featured in the Indian Express basically talks about the bridge collapse that has happened in the Morbi region of Gujarat. Now the bridge was located over the Macchu River, and UPSC in the previous year has asked questions related to various rivers, and such a questions related to Narmada River was seen in the year 2013. Rivers are important under the geography section and thus are important from the perspective of prelims. The practice question here says, consider the following statement. The first statement is, Macchu River originates in central Saurashtra region of Gujarat and drains into run of Kutch. Now this statement is correct, as Macchu River originates in central Saurashtra region of Gujarat from the Madla Hills and flows northwards and drains into run of Kutch. The second statement says, the flow of the river is north to south. Now our explanation under the statement 1, it is clear that the river flows from south to north and not from north to south, and hence statement 2 is incorrect. Moving on to the third statement, it says Saurashtra region is source for many rivers which follows dendritic drainage pattern. Now this statement is again wrong, as Saurashtra has a radially outward drainage pattern and many rivers have their origin located in the highlands of central Saurashtra and drain from there in all the directions. Some of the rivers associated with the region are Bhadra River and Shetrunji River. Shetrunji River drains into the Gulf of Khambat after rising in the Girnar Hills, and Bhadra River, after rising in the Rajkot district in central Saurashtra, flows westward towards the Arabian Sea, where it meets the Arabian Sea near Porbandar. The question further says, choose the correct code, and as only statement 1 is correct, the correct code for the given question will be option C. The next article that has featured in the Indian Express basically talks about Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, as National Unity Day was celebrated on 31st of October. Now UPSC under the history section has asked questions related to various personalities that were associated with the freedom struggle, and thus this region becomes important for us from the perspective of prelims. A question related to personality was also seen in the year 2021. The practice question in this regard says, consider the following statements regarding Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. The first statement here is, he was the president of Indian National Congress during 1931 session. Now this statement is correct, as Sardar Patel was elected as the president of the INC in its Karachi session in 1931. The second statement here says, resolutions related to fundamental rights and national economic program was adopted during this session. Now this statement is again correct, as resolution on fundamental rights which guaranteed free speech, free press, right to form association, right to assemble, universal adult franchise, equal legal rights, neutrality of state was guaranteed under this session. A national economic program was also introduced, which was a role model for India to be followed after independence, wherein it was promised that substantial reduction in rent and revenue in case of landholders and peasants will take place. Relief from agriculture indebtedness will also be taking place. Exemption from rent of uneconomic holdings, right to workers in the industrial sectors, and state ownership and control of key industries, mines, and means of transport was also promised under the National Economic Program. Moving on to the third statement, he says he was the head of Union Powers Committee and Advisory Committee on Fundamental Rights. Now this statement is incorrect. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel headed various crucial committees of the Constituent Assembly of India, which included Advisory Committee on Fundamental Rights, Committee on Minorities and Tribal and Excluded Areas, Committee on Provincial Constitution. But it was Jawaharlal Nehru who was the head of Union Power Committee and not Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. The question further says choose the correct code, and as only statement 1 and 2 are correct, the correct code for the given question will be option A. Moving on to the next article that has featured in the Indian Express, basically talks about the government fiscal challenge or the deficit which is bound to happen as there has been a rise in incremental spending by the government. Now UPSC in the previous has asked questions related to various deficit, and such a question was also seen in the year 2015 when UPSC asked about fiscal deficit and tax revenue as a percentage of GDP. The practice question in this regard says, which among the following is or are referred to as twin deficits in an economy? The first here is fiscal deficit, and fiscal deficit is a part of twin deficit. The second example is of revenue deficit, which is incorrect. The third is current account deficit, which also forms the part of twin deficit. And the fourth here is primary deficit, which again is incorrect. The question further says, select the correct answer using the code given below. And as only 1 and 3 are correct, that is fiscal deficit and the current account deficit being collectively referred as twin deficit, and hence the correct code will be option C. Now moving on to the last question of the day that has featured in the Indian Express, basically talks about the P notes, as the investment in the P note have risen to a new high of 87,813 crore in the month of September. Now UPSC has previously also asked questions related to participatory note, and such a question was seen in the year 2019. A practice question in this regard can be framed, and the practice question says, with reference to the offshore derivative instruments ODIs, consider the following statement. The first statement here is, offshore derivative instruments are used by foreign investors to invest in India's capital market. Now this statement is correct. The second statement here is, all the ODIs are registered with the SEBI. Now this statement is incorrect, as not all the offshore derivative instruments are registered with SEBI. For example, P notes. P notes are used by foreign investors to invest in Indian security market without getting registered with the SEBI. P notes are issued by the foreign portfolio investors who are themselves registered with the SEBI, and then these foreign portfolio investors invest on the behalf of persons who they have issued the P notes to. Further, going a little deeper, this brings us to a question, why the P notes are preferred. These P notes are preferred because of the ease of trading, that is, they are not required to register with the SEBI. They provide a level of anonymity and can also be used as a method of tax avoidance, which have been highlighted by various economists over the world. The question further says, which of the statement given above is or are correct, and as only first statement is correct, the correct code for the given question will be option A. So that were the questions from today's newspaper. Stay tuned for more such updates.